Yeah, here.
I'm not used to having my photograph taken. I'm behind the camera normally. We're going to go away?
Okay, super. Okay, super, danke. Hi, Tim. Well, thanks so much for coming to Zurich. First, maybe we can start. There's so much, you've had such a great impact on the British film industry in particular, but also globally, the European film industry as well. But maybe we could start going way back to when you started in this industry. You came at it from a slightly different angle than most. You came at it from music videos in the 80s. Can you maybe tell us how you got started and how you started making movies?
Yep, sure. It was in the early 80s, and then Eric and I actually didn't work together in music videos, but we led very parallel paths in terms of what we did. And we both started working in music videos in the early 80s, and the music videos were a very young industry at that point. They'd only just really started. And the film industry in England was very unionized at that point. It was very difficult to get into, and it was a sort of a bit of a closed shop. So music videos provided an opportunity for young people to start making films, basically. And I'd been working as a runner for a company called Video Arts that made films, training films. So it was run by John Cleese. And I'd worked for a guy called, I'd worked for John, and just learnt and sort of loved film there. And I looked at the guys who are running Video Arts, and I thought, well, the best job that you can possibly do is none of this stuff in the middle, but be a producer, because they seem to earn all the money and do the least, basically. So that's the job that I want. Music videos were starting as I teamed up with a lady named Sarah Radcliffe. We decided that we would try and make music videos with feature film directors, basically. So we had a few younger directors, and we had a guy named Derek Jarman, who's a good friend of ours, who was directing music videos. And I chased after feature film directors because our ambition was to start making movies if we possibly could. So we wanted to meet people who were in that world. One of the people I chased after was a guy called Nick Rogue, who you probably all know, and I learnt a lot about film directors through him because he invited me round to his house, and Nick likes a drink, basically. And he got me thoroughly pissed and talked a lot of bullshit, and then said to me, there's a huge book on his desk, and he said, I'm thinking of making a movie about this. And it was a big book about a very obscure Turkish general. And so I took the book away, and I thought, well, I was 21 years of age. I thought, well, I better read the whole of this book, because Rogue will, that's the way I'll get back in to see him again, see whether I can get him to do a video. And I went back to see him, I think it was on a Friday night. I read this book all weekend. Went back to see him on the Monday or Tuesday, and I said, oh, Mr. Rogue, it's great. I read the book. He said, what was it like? Never read it. So I learned that directors were lying scoundrels right from the beginning, basically. Most importantly, the film director that I asked to do a music video in that time was Stephen Frears. And he had at that point made many movies for the films for the BBC. He'd made just made a picture called The Hit for Jeremy Thomas. And shortly after making the music video, which wasn't a very good one, much to my surprise, he sent me a script. And at the same time as this music video thing starting, there were three sort of perfect things happening. And a lot of people went into the movie industry at this time in England. There were three things happening. One is the music video business. Two is that a company called Channel 4 had just started, which was the fourth TV channel, and it had a mandate to work with independent producers and independent directors. And it also had a film wing, basically. And the third thing was that we were in the middle of Thatcherism, and that the unions were basically being taken to pieces in Britain, so that it enabled people to get into industries that they might not have previously been able to get into. But Channel 4, Film 4, had developed a screenplay developed a number of scripts. When the channel first started going, is that the first thing that the commissioning editors did is they went out and they got various people around the country in various theatres and things who didn't necessarily write for film to write a piece. And one of the people they went to was a writer in residence at the Royal Court, who's a guy named Hanif Qureshi. And they commissioned him to write a screenplay about anything. And he wrote a film about his world, basically. And he added into it a gay bother boy. And it was called My Beautiful Laundrette. And that script got delivered to Stephen because they decided that they'd like him to direct it. And Stephen, because he had really enjoyed the music video experience and working with a bunch of young people, brought it to Sarah and myself to produce. And I'll finish in a second on this anecdote. And so I was 24, Sarah was a little bit older than me. And we had to go up to Channel 4 in London for a meeting. And on the way up it's Charlotte Street in those days. And on the way up the street, Stephen said to me, I only make films in February. I was like, what? And we went into this meeting, it was in November. And they said we had a very nice meeting and all the rest of it. And they said, what's going to happen? Well, I said, he only makes films in February, so he better get started. And that was definitely the easiest film that I ever got funded.
Well, obviously, The Beautiful Laundrette was really a touchstone for the British film industry, almost for a generation, if I'm not being exaggerated on that part. But I think it really changed a lot of things about how people saw British film at that time. But for you and for Working Title, it was really, I think, without exaggeration, 4 Weddings and a Funeral that changed the way the company worked and changed everything about it. Can you tell first, how did that film get made? How did that come about?
Is that post Laundrette, Sarah and I made a number of films independently, basically, and amongst those was a film called The Tall Guy, which was a film that Richard Curtis had written. And we'll skip through it quickly, but it was a film that got done, and I'd financed it in a slightly tricky way, where I'd got a TV company to pay for the whole movie, and they'd written the production costs off against their advertising revenue. So about 2 years after The Tall Guy came out, we were still independents then, and we were sort of bankrupt, as most independent film producers are. And I got a check from the TV company that had produced a film for £100,000, and I thought, that's nice, we'll take that one. But for some reason, honesty got the better part of me that day, which is a strange thing for a film producer to say. And I thought, there were some profit participants on this film, weren't there? And I went back and looked through the paperwork, and Richard was one of them. And I sent him a check for £15,000, and he was so surprised to receive this check that he sent me the manuscript for 4 Weddings and a Funeral. So that's how the screenplay came about. And we were friends as well, but I chucked the anecdote in. Is that basically, Eric and I had started working together in 1992. And at that point, we found finance from a company called Polygram, which was setting up a European studio. And they took a big interest in Working Title. And we created the working title that really exists today. And we were given money to cover our overhead. We were given money to develop films, and when it came to it, we could go to them for the production finance, basically. And sometimes they gave it to us, and sometimes they didn't. But most importantly, we set up this structure and a business of people who were only in the business of producing films. They weren't in the business of financing films or distributing films or whatever. Working Title was set up to develop and produce movies. And 4 Weddings was one of the early films that came through that company. Is the big bit of luck for 4 Weddings was that the Polygram were just going into the film industry at the same time, and they'd invested a lot, not only in Working Title, but in other production companies, but also in distribution companies around the world. And they'd set one up in France, they'd set one up in the UK, they'd set one up in America at that point. And what they hadn't had at that point was a hit movie. And when 4 Weddings came along, which was made for no money at all, it was made for $4, $5, $6 million, and it began to test well, they thought, this may be the one that can really set this machine going. And they spent a lot of money in distributing the film and giving it big, whacking it out like a big movie rather than like a small independent film. And then it caught fire with the audience, and you know, this little $5 million movie did more than $250 million worldwide. So that was nice.
And it also seemed to establish sort of what people might call the working title film. I mean, it's a very British movie, very British humor, British. I mean, they weren't stars at the time. Hugh Grant and so on wasn't a household name as he is today. Very, very British, but it worked like a studio film, like a blockbuster worldwide, and that seems to have been, if we want to call it the model, that seems to be the pattern that working title has built on. You've made films like Notting Hill, also very British, Richard Curtis movie, even Les Miserables, which is British source material, but made on a budget much smaller than a typical studio film, which has gone on to make over 400 million worldwide. You're basically the only guys who've done this, who've managed to make studio-style films outside from a very local perspective. How have you managed to do that? And I mean, is it possible to do it in other countries?
I think Four Weddings was a really important movie because up to that point, you know, there were sort of big British films that had come about. I mean, I guess Chariots of Fire had preceded it as a smallish British movie in recent time at that point that had done very well. But it was a very important film because we discovered through Four Weddings that you could make an English language movie that wasn't American that would find an audience all around the world, and we thought that is a really interesting thing to have discovered. And very importantly, our own audience in the UK came out in droves to that film. You know, it did 20 or 30 million pounds, I think, at the box office, and the biggest British film before that in the previous decade had probably been 2, 3, 4, 5 million pounds. So it was a massive thing. And I think what happened on the back of Four Weddings, that filmmakers like Richard and you know, Danny Boyle, although we haven't worked with him, but they because Train Spotting was shortly after that, but it was around about that time as well, those filmmakers, British filmmakers, decided to stay in Britain and make films, and that Working Title was able to give some of them a very good home where they could make a British movie rather than going to Hollywood and making a Hollywood movie, and they could enjoy the benefits of what a Hollywood studio would provide them, which is probably a better budget than they'd get anywhere else. Certainly, you know, a good creative wrap blanket, as it were. And most importantly, when the film was completed, it would give them at that point via Polygram, and then after Polygram ceased to be in 1998 via our relationship with Universal, it would give them worldwide distribution, so that single source worldwide distribution, so that if the film was good, that the studio decided they would distribute it all around the world, and it would just be one lot of people who were doing that, rather than like most independent films where you've sold the rights off to all sorts of different people all around the world. And then, if the film performed, because it was enjoying studio-type distribution, they would benefit, and they would benefit very well. So that there's all of these sort of things which nobody had been able to do before as a production company, kept a lot of these filmmakers in Britain making British material. So that went on to be like Joe Wright and Edgar Wright and Stephen Daldry and Paul Greengrass and all of the people that we've worked with subsequent to that film who've stayed basically rather than gone. The preceding generations they'd make a small film in Britain and then they'd head off to Hollywood basically, and you know, the Alan Parkers and the Scott brothers and Michael Apted and people like that, who are big filmmakers that preceded us, is they'd done one film and then they'd headed out to California and on the whole made Hollywood movies. So I think that's what we just got a niche. And what happened is we were very, very lucky to have the Polygram years, because through the Polygram years, not only did we make Four Weddings, but we then made the Bean movies with Rowan Atkinson, we made Elizabeth, we made a few films with the Coen brothers, but we made a number of movies that were relatively low budget films to make that then did very well. And so that when Polygram came to an end, we were able to access a studio deal, which nobody else was really able to do. And it was an enlightened studio because none of the studios do have you know, production arrangements with non-American companies on the whole. So I mean, we are very, very lucky at Working Title to have that.
And how important is the Britishness of Working Title from the material, from your approach? I'm interested in that particularly because it's the big question across Europe of how do you make a big film industry like you guys have managed to do in the UK, and you've done it by staying British, or is that what's the core of your success?
We've never been afraid of America. It's right from music video days, as Eric and I would zap out to America independently, and so we got used when we were young to going to New York and to LA, and we never treated, you know, one of the malaises of, I think, of the English film industry is they're nervous of Hollywood and they slightly treat it as the enemy. And we learned to embrace it, and that we learned that if you're going to make films that were bigger than small films, is you needed to work closely with Hollywood, and the reason for that is that all of the distribution's controlled out of Hollywood around the world. Most of the money in film, whether it be small money or big money, it goes via Hollywood. And most importantly is that all of the talent, you know, actors, writers, directors, producers, have American representation. And so one of the big talent agencies will represent anybody who's had any success from whatever nation, basically. So, you know, you have a successful Swiss filmmaker or German filmmaker or French filmmaker or English filmmaker, they have one hit, they will be represented by a Hollywood agent. And that those agents are very powerful. They can't make anybody do anything, but they can sure as hell stop people from doing things, basically. And that is, so we learned that you have to work with these people, and that not only have to work with them, but we enjoyed working with these people because, you know, they were making films and getting films made. So right from those early music video days, we had a presence in Hollywood, and the woman who you know runs our LA office, which is a small little office, has worked for us for 25 years. You know, because the other thing we learned as Europeans is that we wanted to live in Europe and we wanted to work from London, but we knew we needed that Hollywood, we needed to work Hollywood in order to make that possible. But we also learned that if we weren't there, we had to have somebody there because, you know, the problem with being in Europe is you only cross over with Hollywood for a few hours a day and you're out of sight and out of mind. So we decided to have somebody there right from the start. So if you like, we've had a fantastic collaboration with Hollywood, and it's been mutually advantageous because, you know, many of the directors that we've introduced to the film industry or done their first films and all the rest of it, you know, they've gone on to be represented well by Hollywood agents, and many of them have gone on and done studio films. So it's very much two-way traffic. And
you talked about obviously the distribution side and your relationships you had with Polygram and now with Universal. But what would you say is been the real sort of secret of success as a producer? I mean, what do you think is the most important element of what you do that has made Working Title so successful?
I think that, you know, when in 1992, when Eric and I set up the sort of perfect, what we considered to be the perfect production company, is we thought, what do we need? And we thought, well, we need a big development department, because really and truly, if you don't find great source material and you then don't turn that source material into a great script, there's no point in starting out in this whole process. So right from the start, we had a development department in London, a development department in LA, that we had somebody scouting for books, so that looking for source material, and then we made sure that they were properly supported by other staff, because I look upon the development process as being the most important part of the process, and I look upon the development expense in two areas, which is that you have to be able to afford to pay writers, you know, decently, but you also need to then work with writers and have good people who've done it before working with them, so that you get the very best out of the process. I mean, one of the reasons that we went into business with Polygram back in 1992 was that we realized that as an independent producer, you don't really, everything's sort of conspiring against you, because, you know, you can only develop a limited number of things because you haven't got the resources to develop more than that. Is that you are probably financially dependent upon getting those one of those limited number of things into production probably before it is actually ready to go, and that it isn't good enough. And that you're spending 80% of your time rushing around trying to raise money, rather than spending 80% of your time on trying to creatively get that script as good as you possibly can. Then once the script's as good as you can possibly get it, putting the right ingredients around it to make it into a decent movie. So I can't even remember what the question was, but I hope that was interesting.
It was sort of about the sort of secret of your success.
So it's development, and then when you have got the material and working the script, and not being afraid to work the script as hard as you possibly can, and that once you've got that right, making sure that you then put the right ingredients around it in terms of the creative team, i.e. the right director particularly, and then the right actors and the right cameraman, designer, and all the rest of it. But also, really, really importantly, and I think this is the big thing for us, is making it at the right price point. So, you know, unless you're making a massive visual effects film or a superhero movie or whatever, is most films can be made for any price, I think. And that, you know, because both Eric and I came from independent film and had a good smell of the market, because we'd had our noses in it, basically, is that when we look at a script and a package, as it were, we'll also look at what we think it might do in the once it's completed, in terms of what could this movie do in the marketplace, and then try and work back from that to a number that we feel comfortable with to make it. You know, and for instance, Les Miserables is a very good example, actually, because it was a film that, you know, was pretty ambitious, but not without a great deal of risk, in that, you know, that musicals sometimes, you know, Mamma Mia had worked at the box office, but, you know, others hadn't. That it was a big, sprawling European tale. You know, what it had going for it was a gigantically successful musical. But there was a lot of negotiation about what the production number should be for that. And I would argue that a Hollywood producer, or done through a Hollywood, you know, traditionally through a Hollywood studio, that film would have cost probably double what it actually cost through us, because, you know, we all worked very hard at making that film for a price, and everyone reaped the benefits of that. You know, is the other thing you can do when you make a film at the right price is you can give the creative, everyone feels more comfortable with giving the director and the creative elements of the film more freedom, basically. And that's what I try and do as a producer. At the end of the day, and Eric absolutely does it as well, is we feel fortunate to work with the creative people that we do. And if you like, what I do anyway is I try and create a box within which that creative person can work. So you say, okay, this piece, let's call it X, with these people in it, Y and Z, and this sort of, and your track record is worth $20 million, basically, and we'll give you $20 million to make it, and we'll work very hard with you on doing it, but we'll give you the creative freedom to work to make it in your way within that thing. And if you come out of the box, I'm going to bash you on the head and make sure you go back into that box. But that's the sort of deal. And you know, I think, you know, film is a director's medium, actually, and if that more often than not, that system seems to have worked for us. You know, the worst scenario is where the worst scenario on a movie is kind of when it becomes gigantically collaborative and there are too many voices going into it. You know, and the best scenario is where you've got a good producer, a great writer, and a really good director and good actors, and everybody's doing their job properly. But when the lines get blurred is when it gets complicated.
Oh, well, how do you manage that? I mean, you must have had some confrontations with directors. You've had some very strong-minded directors in your career.
Yeah, I did a movie just before Eric and I got together in 1991 called Map of the Human Heart, which is with a guy called Vincent Ward, who's a fantastic New Zealand film director, but he is very artistic and all the rest of it. And I remember having a confrontation. I don't know how many movie sets you've all been onto, but certainly in England, what happens is at meal times, as you go, there's a converted double-decker bus with tables in it, basically, that you go and sit in to have your meal. And I remember sitting with Vincent having an argument on the top of one of these double-decker buses about what he could or couldn't do that day. And he was very hungry that morning for some reason, because he had a big plate of scrambled eggs and bacon and all sorts of shit sitting in front of him. And I managed to make him so angry that he chucked it in my face. So there was no element of humiliation. After that, I thought, okay, I don't think it'll ever get worse than this in terms of confrontation with a director. So luckily, I learnt young. Is you have to. I remember with. I was doing a picture called The Interpreter with Sidney Pollack, and we were in the United Nations, and one of the actors wouldn't come out of their caravan for some reason, and we had 3,000 extras, and I said to Sidney after about an hour, listen, you've got to go and do something about this, and he said, you know what, there's no point, because they'll come out when they're ready. And if I go and do something about it now, it'll end up in a fight, and we'll lose the whole day. But they'll come out when they're ready, and we'll do 6 hours, and that's better than losing a whole day, which I thought was a very philosophical and sensible way around the whole thing. He also said to me, by the way, you're looking at the man who spent a whole year of his life waiting for Robert Redford, because he'd made 5 pictures with him, and Redford was notoriously late. So I think it's always about, there's no point in having massive confrontation. You know, it is a creative process, and that in the creative process, all sorts of forces come to bear, and people react in strange ways and all the rest of it. And confrontation very, very rarely is the solution to your problem. And I think we've always tried to be, and I think one of the reasons that Eric and I have had such good luck in terms of the people that we've worked with, and then people who've continued to want to work with us, is that we try to be as collaborative as we possibly can.
What's been your most successful collaboration, either on a personal level or professional? I mean, you've had Richard Curtis's career, Rowan Atkinson's career, actors like Hugh Grant, who are very directly connected to Working Title and their careers. What has been for you the most successful?
Well, I think the longest one's been Richard, you know, because we've done, you know, we've done all of Richard Curtis's movies from The Tall Guy onwards. So Tall Guy, Four Weddings, Notting Hill, Love Actually, Boat That Rocked, and About Time. But he also was a writer on the Bridget Jones movies, and he was a collaborator with Rowan Atkinson on the Bean movies. So in terms of the films, and that's been a massive span. That's been a 25-year span. But you know, right now we're on our 3rd film with Edgar Wright. We're on our 5th film with Joe Wright. We're on our 5th film with Stephen Frears. You know, we're on our 2nd film with Stephen Daldry. We've done several with the Coens. So, you know, they've all been. One of the things that we were fortunate enough to do post '92 was that we'd come from being independents, and we'd learned that as an independent, what happens is you tend to do one film at a time, and that you tend to put an awful lot of energy into doing that film, and you forget about developing the next one while you're doing it. So there's an awful gap between pictures. And one of the things that we very consciously said in 1992, and one of the things where we very much wanted to work in partnership, because we realized we could cover a lot of ground by doing that, was to always have a slate of movies, basically, so that you're never entirely dependent on one. You've always got several films going on, and try to have a few films in distribution, quite a lot of films in development, and a few in production. And also, when you're choosing what films to do on your slate, is make sure that there's a proper variety in there. And if you want to make an Atonement, which is a film with a pretty small bullseye in terms of you have to get it right in order to connect with an audience, is trying to have a Mr. Bean or something like that, where you don't need such a big bullseye in order to make money out of it. So I think that sort of slate approach has meant it's led to us having a number of different creative collaborations. So they're very different people making different sorts of movies, and I think that's part of the success of Working Title. On the whole, they tend to be British, and on the whole, we try and make them there, and particularly now, because of the tax credit situation in the UK, it's an extremely advantageous place to go and make a movie, which has evolved. But you know, in terms of the world right now, is England's one of the most busy production centres in the world. So yeah.
And your longest and most successful collaboration, of course, has been with your partner, with Eric Fellner. How you are quite different people. How do you work together as a production couple, so to speak?
Yeah, we tend to work on different films, so that, you know, when something comes into the company, it'll usually be because one of us, in terms of an idea or a book or a you know, however it arrives, one of us will champion it, basically. You know, I think the thing about film producing is you have to be very, very tenacious, is you really have to keep that spirit up. You know, I always tell the story of when before computers and before mobile phones almost, but when everything was on paper and you had a filing cabinet, is I always felt that you had to get through a filing cabinet's length of rejection letters in order to get a movie made. And I think the definition of a film producer is somebody who doesn't feel depressed with it when there's only one in there, but says, yeah, we're 1 millimeter closer towards getting this film financed. So you both have to be, you have to be tenacious, but you also have to keep your enthusiasm up at a very high level for whatever it is you're trying to do, and there's a lot of adversity in that, and that if there's two of you and you have enthusiasm for different things, that is enormously helpful. And you know, and I think that we're very supportive of one another in the taste of what the other one's pursuing and all the rest of it. But we do realise that you just don't have enough energy to be enthusiastic about that amount of stuff. Then in terms of the business of getting things done and dealing with the studio and dealing with directors and dealing with people, you know, we have different styles, but ultimately we get to the same place, and there's such a shorthand once you've worked together for such a long time. And I think, you know, there's also it's good because it keeps you on your toes, because there's an element of unspoken competition, which I think is good, you know, where you think, oh, his film did quite well, so, you know, I better, you know, I need to do that one then. And there's an element of keeping it in yourself in check on things, because you're thinking, you know, is that too risky or whatever, and you're sort of seeing what you're doing through the other person's eyes, you know.
Well, obviously you've had tremendous success with so many of your films. What were the most difficult? What was the most difficult film to get made? Well, I mean, what are sort of the real horror stories of getting a film made, where afterwards you said, well, maybe it was worth it from what was up on the screen?
Sadly, when they're really difficult, you quite often get to the end of it and think that wasn't worth it. But you know, all films have their own story, and I'm not going to pick one out that's more difficult than others. Is interestingly, you know, even though we're as lucky as you get when it comes to produce, because we have a studio deal and all the rest of it, it's always difficult. Is that people don't just say yes, even when and you always have to work at it, and you always have to get it to the right level. I think the most tricky ones are when you don't have a director who's maybe as good as they should be. Is that, or that's that, and you realise it. The odd thing about film direction is you don't really know until you've started. Is, you know, you can get a bad film director can get all the way through pre-production very easily, basically, and they don't get caught out until you start shooting. And then even then you might not know for a while, you know, and you only really know when you get to the cutting room. Luckily these days you see so much more as you go along. So I think that's one area. It's usually when you're trying to do something at the wrong price point, and you know, because of that tenacity and having to keep that enthusiasm up, it is possible to make to push something harder than one should in order to just because that's the nature of what you do as a film producer is you have to be pretty stubborn, and it's sometimes that stubbornness is not necessarily a good thing, you know. And then sometimes you get into situations. I did a picture with a few years ago with Paul Greengrass called Green Zone, where we ended up in a horrible situation because it was the beginning of the writer's strike. That we had a star on board and Matt so we were ready to go. Is that the script was okay but not perfect, and the budget going in we hadn't really nailed down, and there were all sorts of conspiring things that came together to make it a very tricky and uncomfortable process. You know, the film turned out fine, but it cost too much, and that for both Paul and for I and for everyone who was attached to it, it was a really tricky and very long experience, and you learn from that.
One film from Paul Greengrass that I'd actually bring up as a counterexample of that was one you made beforehand with him, United 93. That seems like an almost impossible movie to make. It was about if anyone who hasn't seen it, you should go out and see it. It's about the 9/11 attacks, the plane where the passengers overcame the terrorists and crashed the plane. Was made almost like a documentary. Yeah. Very complex, very difficult, and very difficult to actually get made, and many said one could never do it. You can never tell that story, not at that time and not any time. You did, and it was quite successful. How did you manage to even get that film made?
Well, the thing about that film is that Paul wanted to do something about 9/11, and Eric and I have been interested in doing something about 9/11 as well. And I can't remember what working title film it was, but we just made a film for the studio that had made quite a lot of money, and that Paul had just done The Second Born, and they desperately wanted him to do The Third Born at the time. And so we realized there was a sort of window of opportunity to probably get something done that one might not get done under other circumstances. And so we went to see, and Stacey Snyder who was running the studio at the time, and we went to see her and said, listen, we'd like to do this, and we want to do it for this amount of money. And remember, Paul had come from these sorts of films, and Bloody Sunday was the film that really put him on the map. And so she backed us and said, listen, as long as you don't spend more than $15 million, you can do it. So that was, and probably no other combination of people would have been able to do that, if you see what I mean. It's because it was two bits of good fortune at the same place, you know. And then what happened is he wrote a treatment for it. It was a very interesting film because on the whole we come from very tightly scripted drama, and that we spend a lot of time in terms of getting the script right, and it tends to be that it's about that we know the genre, that we tell a story, we work on the characters, we get the emotion right, and we get all of those things on the page before we actually start, and we're strict about it. On United 93, it was a completely different approach because we decided to take a vaguely documentary approach to it, and the script was basically a timeline on a wall that we had in the rehearsal room, where we knew stuff that had gone on from 8 o'clock in the morning, or it was 7:30 in the morning through to whatever it was, 11, is we'd put it in, you know, plane takes off, plane dives, phone call received, Newark Tower sees so-and-so, blah, 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 blah. So we did, but that was that, and we decided that the bit of the movie where, and it sounds horrible, where people were still alive, anything that was happening on the ground, is we try and get people who were there to play those parts, basically. So that was the decision that we made. And then preceding any of this is we sent a researcher out to all of the families who had people on the plane to get their permission to do the film. And a young woman who's working for us now on another movie actually went to see every single family and managed to get them to sign off. And then for what happened on the plane is we based it on this fact sheet, and Paul ran these, we cast it out of New York, and he ran these improvised sessions in a rehearsal room, and we began to write stuff down from that. And then when we came to shoot it, we put the picture on the plane on a big gimbal, the body of the plane on a big gimbal so we could move it like that and like that on a stage in Pinewood in the UK. And we ran the flight 14 times, morning and night, morning and afternoon, over 7 days. And we had 3 cameras on board, handheld, and all the rest of it. And it was a very, very weird process because you felt that, and they improvised, and you felt that in the process of this improvisation and going over and over again, that we distilled it to some form of truth, basically. And I don't know whether any of you have seen the film or not, but it kind of feels like that. And it has this, it's very emotionally charged, the movie, but it's also, something came out of that whole process about the human spirit, which was like, you know, transcended the film, as it were. So it was a very interesting, and it's a very different sort of film for a working title to have made, but it's a picture that we're very proud of.
That example also showed how well you were able to work within a studio-like system to get very different types of movies made, and that's been a constant theme throughout Working Title's career. The studio system is changing quite dramatically and has changed since you've been there. What do you see as the biggest transformations that have happened in the studio business, and how is that going to affect what kind of movies you'll be able to make in the future and how you can make them?
I think there's no doubt our sorts of films are getting more difficult, is that the studio system is, you know, and rightly so, because it's a huge business, is more interested in tentpole movies. And the thing about those tentpole movies is they're becoming very, very expensive. So that in order to compete, those tentpole movies, their budgets are going up, and then when they come to be marketed, the marketing budget's going up, and that the resources of any given studio are limited, so that you know, rightly, because when they work, they throw off the revenues that keeps the whole thing going. The resources of a studio are heading towards that, and it's not only the studio. It's also, I think, the other thing on our sorts of movies that's competing with us a lot at the moment is that the home video, not the home experience of watching a movie is so much more sophisticated, and these smaller character-driven films people get quite used to seeing in that environment, and they like to and a lot of our films, luckily, they like to see over and over again, so that, and they get used to seeing it in that environment. In fact, Richard was telling me, we were just talking about it yesterday, and he said his daughter had said, you know, that's the thing with these sorts of films, is that that's where people tend to watch them. And the other thing that's competing with our films a lot at the moment is high-end American cable drama, the big series, which has become so much better in the last 5 or 6 years. And you've got people who were working in feature films working on those sorts of, you know, Breaking Bads and, you know, Mad Men and all of that, where you've got these very sophisticated writers. You've got the best writers in the world wanting to work in those arenas at the moment, and that the audience is enjoying those series a lot. The box set phenomena is a big one. You know, I know it from my kids, is that there's nothing better. So all of those things are competing undoubtedly with what we do, and that it's more of a juggle. So if you're not working in an arena where there's an obvious commercial imperative, you know, like Rowan Atkinson or a Bridget Jones movie, or, you know, one of Edgar's movies, where it's in a series. I think there has to be something quite startling about whatever you're trying to do, more startling than there used to be, in order to get everyone excited about it. And everyone's a little bit more trigger shy, you know, for a very good set of reasons. So, which is all fine, but one also has to, you know, part of what we do is about taking some risks as well, and you need to be able to take creative risks with new writers, new directors, new actors, and all the rest of it. So it's getting that balance right. Listen, it's never been easy. Nobody's ever said of any movie, here, just go and do it. There's always if, but, maybe, what, why, you know. And I think the thing that anybody who pays for movies, whether it's an independent financier or whether it's a studio head, their default position is no. And so you've always got to get over that hurdle.
Well, I'd like to open it up a bit to the audience now. We've got a couple of microphones here, so if you just raise your hand, maybe woman over here, blonde, in the middle, first.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I would like to know from you, Tim, when you are producing a movie, are you also trying to do it in a sustainable way, like in the UK, a couple of producers tend to do that, and also the studios? So are you trying to get into this kind of green production, or is this not an issue?
No, we're green. We're as green as they come. No, as our head of production, yeah. No, because there's a lot of waste in movies, and we're very conscious of that. You know, when big sets get destroyed and all the rest of it, and just burnt. So yeah, we are very much part of a program. There's I can't remember what it's called. Our head of production, Misha Wright, knows it, but we try and do all of those things to the best of our ability.
Maybe up here.
Sustainability.
Mentioned a few times the importance of a script, and I was wondering, what is it that makes a script a great script? How do you know?
This is a sweeping generalization, but I'll make it anyway. Is that it tends to be for us that when we've found an idea or a book or whatever that we're going to develop, is that either Eric or I, and then one of our heads of development and probably an assistant will sit down and we'll do a list of screenplay writers that we think will be suitable to work on this material, and we'll go out to 5 of them probably and take meetings with a couple of them who respond and all the rest. Is then whether it's a book or an idea or whatever, is what we tend to do is we tend to brainstorm with the writer and get them to write what we call a beat sheet, which is to get to come up with basically the structure of the piece. So that it's a couple of pages or 2 or 3 pages long, and it divides it into 3 acts, and it just in bullet points says what's going to happen in each act and who and all the rest of it. And then we kick that around a little bit, and then we set the writer off to write. And the reason that beat sheet's quite a good idea is it's like a map, basically, so you kind of all know the direction that you're headed in. Is that then it tends to be that the first draft that comes in tends to be, unless it's an amazing writer, and this happens not often, but you know, if it's a Curtis or a Stoppard or something like that, you probably bypass this bit. But it tends to be that the first draft is a fairly bald rendition of the story, and I think the process of script development is then about developing the characters and the emotion of the piece, so that the story is driven by the characters and the emotion rather than the story being up front in your face. And there's a sort of magic to that, and you reach a point in the process where you think, is that happening now? Or you sort of almost forget the story, and so you fall in love with the characters, and the characters pull you through the piece, and whatever the emotion is, if it's funny, the comedy, or if it's scary, the scares, or if it's thrilling, the thrills, they creep up on you again. You know, like I just read a script today actually where Joe Wright, who I work with, is going to do a live action version of The Little Mermaid, and we've had quite a few issues in terms of developing the script, but for the first time, you're beginning to touch it, and you think, we're getting close, and this is at the end of a 2-year process or whatever, you know, and it's very exciting. But that's when the emotion and the characters are singing to you, basically, I think, that's when you're ready to go. I don't know if that answers your question.
Maybe back here and then up here. Just pass the mic there. Okay. Tim, you say you're doing major movies. What is when you read a story or a storybook as well, like for a short movie or for TV series, or only you focus on what you can do on major movies?
No, we do. I mean, our prime focus is doing 2, 3, 4 films a year, but we also realise that in order to do that, we have a TV company where we're developing stuff, because we realise that particularly that American miniseries area is something that we have to work in, because there are more all of a sudden there are just a gigantic number of buyers there, and that feels to be like a very obvious area to be having a go at. But also we put little bits of money into shorts and things like that, because we have to. You can't stagnate as a creative company, as you always have to have new blood in there, and you're not going to necessarily give new blood big films straight away. So you need to, if there are people that you're interested in, is you'll invest in their shorts, or you'll help them out on a script for a little bit of money or whatever, because I think it's really important.
Okay, good. Thank you. Here and then up front.
Hello. I've been today to an English bookstore, and I saw that there is a new book by Helen Fielding out about Bridget Jones. Any chance that we will get to see Bridget's new love adventures again?
Maybe.
Hi. What was your biggest commercial flop? What went wrong, and how did you bounce back?
We've been quite good at not discussing that. Obviously there are films along the way that don't do as well as you. I think the bouncing back is easier to talk to because we always try and produce a slate of films. That luckily, on the whole, when we've had films that haven't worked, there's been one that does. And I think that the fact is the movie business is a hit-driven business, and everybody within it knows that you're not going to have a hit every time, and it's really about mitigating your losses. There's a period of time a few years ago where we realized we had a whole bunch of movies that were costing too much money in production at the same time. That was just before the crash, and we shocked ourselves in that process, and we realized that we had to, we'd got cocky in a way, that we had to tighten our belts and apply the discipline that we always do to making films. None of them, those films in themselves, was a massive loss. That just collectively they all cost too much money, basically, and it was like, okay, we need to watch this. And I think you always have to be. In many ways, the failures are more important than the successes, because you learn from them. Successes, hopefully, you enjoy. In any event, I always say, in terms of film, what's most important is enjoying the process, because the process of making a movie, once you've developed it and packaged it and shot it and post-produced it and all the rest of it, is several years, even on an easy run. And that the process of it coming out is, whether it's a hit or a failure, is a fairly fast one. So enjoy the process.
Okay, just coming back a little bit to the question of television, but the idea of longer films, which are going to be broken down, like Netflix coming out with something saying, okay, give us 7 hours and we'll cut it into something shorter, give it a series and we'll spread it. Is that something that interests you? And the second one, just short question about scripts and screenplays. You're talking about going out to known writers. Your company doesn't accept something that's sent just on speculative basis. How do you actually touch fresh newcomers, which you said you want to?
No, we do, well. and we're very active in going out to newcomers. And if somebody who we know represents somebody to us as a newcomer, then we'll absolutely look at that. And yes, I think in terms of the longer form stuff, I think there's plenty of. It's quite exciting, the whole mini-series and Netflix thing, because there are many stories that one comes across where 90 minutes or 100 minutes doesn't feel long enough, particularly in terms of book adaptations, for the material or story that you've got in front of you. And if it's something that's exciting and you can make the numbers work, I think it is certainly something that we're looking at very, very carefully. And the other exciting thing is, I was in LA just a few months ago, going around all of the buyers, and you thought, oh my God, this is like the film business was 20 years ago. There's 20 of these people who are really interested in edgier TV, and that you only need 2 of them wanting it, and you've got a deal, basically. And I don't think that's true anywhere else at the moment. And I think the other thing about those longer form TV pieces is that the characters that make them work tend to be real fuck-ups, and they're much more complicated characters than you would ever see it developed into a movie on the whole, and I think that's interesting.
Thank you. So a woman, I think, in blue in the middle, and then man in white up here.
Hello. I'm not sure if Working Title done it before, but I was wondering, do you plan to produce a movie that is not an English-speaking movie?
We're doing one at the moment, actually. It's in Portuguese, called Trash, that Stephen Daldry's doing. But on the whole, not.
Okay, so it's the first one.
That's the first one, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
What? Find a mic for you.
I was wondering if you would speak to how different it was to make Les Mis with the different kind of source material, musical source material, and if that's something you would be interested in making more of.
Yeah, I think we're definitely interested in doing other musicals, you know, because it is that, and this is actually Eric and Fellner has had much more experience in the whole musical world than I have, because we produced the stage show of Billy Elliot. We produced the movie and then we produced the stage show of Billy Elliot. And Les Mis was a film that he developed and was a lead producer on. But I think that you know, firstly there was a show that had, but one had to adapt and wrangle into, you know, so the script was quite an interesting process, and I think Bill Nicholson did a very good unsung job in many in terms of evolving the script on that. But you know, I guess the most important thing and the most different thing about it is that on the whole, in every movie, is the music comes last. It's the very last thing in the process that you get to. And when you're doing a musical, the music comes first. And that also, because it's preordained, is that, and it's, you know, it wasn't pre-recorded on Les Mis, but it is usually pre-recorded, is that, you know, it is dictating the terms of what gets shot and the rhythm of the cut and all the rest of it. So it's a very different process, because normally when you hit a scene, if the audience isn't enjoying it, you cut it tight and get out of it. And if it's loving it, you run it long, and a 3-minute conversation can take 10. And there's all of those weapons, as it were, in the arsenal of the filmmaker. On a musical, you don't have that, because a number takes however long it's going to take. So it's a very different rhythm. And Tom Hooper, you know, I think found that a very interesting challenge in terms of directing it. You know, a lot of the stuff was the same as every film, which is, you know, getting through the day and all the rest of it. But it was definitely it was different, which is good. And yes, we will be looking at other ones.
I think way in the back, up there, and then up front here. But first, way in the back. Right back, I think woman in yellow, if I can see properly.
I would be interested if you are looking also into international co-production with other European countries, or are you more interested in mingling up with the Americans?
No, we'll look at doing, you know, it all comes down to the material, to be quite honest. And if there's a really interesting piece that is generated from France and that we feel could work as a international movie, and either Eric or I or somebody at Working Title absolutely loves the story, then, you know, we'll look at the way to do it. You know, the reason that we work with America quite a bit is that we share their language, you know, and that's the main reason, is that it's both a great thing for the British film industry, and it's a difficult thing for the British film industry. But on the whole, I think the British film industry comes out better for sharing the language of America, because more of its films get seen around the world or internationally distributed than most other countries' films.
And what stories are you interested in personally? I mean, yeah, like what does interest you?
Well,
I mean, as a producer.
I think if you look at half of the Working Title films that we've produced, those are the stories that I'm interested in. And I'm pretty interested in the other half as well.
Up here, man up here.
There have been a couple of James Bond movies shot here in Switzerland. And when you see how Zurich is the center of financing for banking around the world, and also you have cantons like Zug and Schwyz and Nidwalden and Oldwalden that are very low in taxes and try to bring in business. What would you suggest, considering that Switzerland basically doesn't even have a movie industry here, really, what would you suggest as to developing a movie industry here in Switzerland? I mean, would you think of like an industrial park area that you build a big warehouse and you draw in the other supporters, or what?
I mean, well, if you look at England, there's two sides to the British film industry. There's what I call a service side of the industry, which is where American pictures come there, and because we have great crews and a fantastic tax credit, is they want to come and shoot there, and that movie stars like to stay in wherever it is they like to stay in London and hang out there. You know, because quite a lot of this comes down to personal, where a director wants to shoot or where a movie star wants to be. And then the other side of the British film industry is, you know, homegrown talent, and I think you have to develop both things. And developing a studio space in the UK, for instance, is sold out. You can't get in there at the moment. So a studio is a good idea. I mean, the problem is, though, that it's a depth of workforce, and that it's finding people who can. The service side of films is massively labour intensive. And I guess you could bring, Italy's got a pretty good film industry, so you could bring technicians up from there. Yeah.
Part two would be, do you see a decentralization away from Hollywood, considering the cost? I mean, like there's a lot of TV is done now up in Vancouver for tax reasons. But
California is a terrible place to shoot at the moment. Nobody shoots there. So, but there's no decentralization because it's too expensive and they haven't got it sorted out. But it hasn't stopped Hollywood from being the center of the industry, and I don't think anything will stop that. You know, basically, everyone goes to wherever their buck is going to go furthest. The only consideration is where can I get the greatest production value for the amount of money that I'm going to spend on this. And if you can come up with something that's competitive, then ultimately people will go there. That is, you know, any film of any size. That's the bottom line consideration: is how much can I get for this, whatever I've got to do it.
I think we have time for one or two more, maybe in the back there, and then this man up here. Sorry, I didn't catch that either. Can you wait? Just wait for the mic. Otherwise,
would you define you like a comedian specialist?
Comedian specialist, if you would define yourself as a comedian specialist.
No, I'm not a comedian specialist. But I've had, you know, one of the things that, first things that when I went into the film industry, somebody said to me is, whatever you do, don't do comedy, because it doesn't travel and nobody's interested in it. And very luckily, I ignored that piece of advice, because the two most successful collaborations that we've had are with Richard Curtis and Rowan Atkinson.
Okay, in the middle here.
When it comes, hello. Oh yeah, now I'm here. When it comes to pitching, what are you looking for, and do you have like a remarkable story, a remarkable pitch that you could share with us as an anecdote?
Yeah, I think what one's looking for is something that isn't boring, because a lot of pitches are, and that somehow grabs one's interest. You know, is something that you haven't seen or heard or smelt before. You know, it was when we did Pride and Prejudice. One of our head of development wanted to develop it, and it had just been a TV series, so we said, okay, yeah, but like nothing's going to come of this. And so she developed the script, and then she said it came in, and the script was all right, wasn't great, and we said, you know, there has to be a reason to do this. And she said, okay, let me bring in some directors. And one of the directors she brought in was this guy, Joe Wright. And Joe came in, and he was obviously an interesting character and sparky and interesting and all the rest of it. And he said, I'll tell you what, mate, here, this is what the first shot is. And he described the tracking shot of Kira walking through the fields and the sun going down behind and all the rest of it. And I thought, shit, that doesn't sound like Pride and Prejudice. That sounds much more interesting. And that, you know, that was because he was original and different and had a take, and that one knew that instantly. You know, and it's amazing. There's in any given year in working title, there's work experience, and there's 4 kids in there every week getting work experience, and so that's however many. That's at least 200 kids going through the company in any given year, and there's only 1 probably, or maybe 2 that you actually notice, and it's always the one who's got the guts to say something or prod something or have an opinion about something or whatever. And I think it's like, if I really want anything now from somebody, is I'll handwrite them a letter, because it's such an extraordinary thing to get. You know, everyone's so used to getting an email or getting a CV that looks exactly the same as everything else. But if you get a handwritten letter, you think, shit, somebody knows how to write, and you read it, you know. And it's a weird piece of advice, but if I wanted anything from anybody, I'd handwrite a letter, because they're much more likely to get read than somebody emailing. You know, you're never going to read somebody. You know, hundreds of CVs a day come in through the computer and all the rest of it. You're not going to look at it.
Well, sorry, I think I have to wrap it up. I'll ask one final question, and give the advice of handwriting letters, which won't work for me because I can't even read my own handwriting.
Nor can I.
But there are a lot of young filmmakers or would-be filmmakers here, producers, probably directors as well, writers. What, if you could give one piece of advice from your long career? You've had ups and downs, but you've come through it and become one of the most successful producers and filmmakers out of Europe. What would be your one piece of advice for young people coming up?
I think to be doing, you know, so if you want to direct, you don't hang around. You just get a camera, and particularly now is shoot, basically. If you want to write. And if you want to produce, get together with one of those people and do it, because too many people. And don't worry. And in the early part of the process, don't worry about what the deal is. Never worry about the deal until you got going. You know, so Sarah and I, and Working Title, and indeed Eric and I, for many years, we never worried about how much money we made. You know, and that too many people are too bound up by all of that. And actually, the most important thing is to be getting something done. And that if you get something done and you're good at it, then you'll get the credit for it, and you'll do a bit better next time, and all the rest of it. And so it's doing the stuff. And rather than talking about the stuff is what I think would be my main piece of advice, and be tenacious.
Well, thanks very much, Eric Fellner. And